The night my family told me not to come home for Christmas, the air outside my apartment window felt sharp enough to cut through bone. My name is Ella Morris, and I used to believe success would make me impossible to ignore. Instead, it made me invisible to the people who raised me. They said I'd embarrass them in front of my sister's wealthy boyfriend, but they didn't know he worked for me. What began as rejection turned into reckoning, and by the time I walked back into that house, I wasn't the same daughter they remembered. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. Christmas lights smear across the wet two-lane as my wipers tick. The rain can't decide if it wants to be sleet, so it needles the windshield and hisses in the gutters. Until my phone chimes, and the part of the evening I can control ends. I'm supposed to be resting. 2 weeks of a mean flu pinned me to the couch. Today is the first time I can stand without a head rush. I make tea, sit at my desk, and reopen a municipal microgrid contract deadlines. My apartment off Merriman is quiet. The screen goes blue, a group video call, Mom, Dad, Tessa, 3 faces in squares. Hey, between revisions. Ella, my mother says in that polite tone, for country club hopefuls and telemarketers. Lorraine perches on the formal sofa back in Woodvale, the one nobody sits on, poinsettias behind her. Dad, Arthur, but everyone calls him Buck, hovers beside her, jaw-tight eyes off camera. Tessa lounges in the armchair, phone in hand, like a scepter. What's up? I was about to book my flight. Lorraine's smile thins. Smile. We need to talk about Christmas. Silence. Then Dad clears his throat. With Tessa's situation, we've decided it's not a good year for you to come home. So calm it scrapes at me. Not a good year, I repeat. Did something happen? Do you need me to... God? Mom? Tessa sighs. Just tell her. She leans toward the camera. I'm bringing my new boyfriend, Graham. He's important. He's used to a certain caliber of person. He networks with families like the Whitfields. I don't want any weirdness. Your office job is hard to explain. I look at Dad. He studies a thumbnail. Mom brightens to a brittle shine. It's just 1 year, dear. We want everything to be perfect. First impressions matter. And I would embarrass you, I say. No one contradicts me. Tessa shrugs. It's Christmas, not a TED Talk. Please don't make this about you. The call ends with promises of something in February, as if affection can be penciled in. The apartment exhales. I stare at the wrapped gifts by the door, a signed cookbook for Mom, insulated gloves for Dad, a ceramic mug thrown by a Maple Hollow 10th grader whose art program I funded. The ribbon on Tessa's gift noise-canceling mics looks suddenly ridiculous. I keep a ledger in my head, bridge loan when Dad's business got strangled by supply chains. Hospital deductible when Tessa sprained her wrist filming. HVAC for the church kitchen. Pantry groceries when donations ran thin. I never wanted credit. I wanted to be loved without an invoice attached. So I kept my worlds apart. Family knew Ella, the quiet one. Business knew initials E.L. Morris. Tea in hand, I open the county website. Rumors have been scratching at town, a lakefront rezoning. Heritage retail luxury cottages, a promenade with Edison bulbs, the curated nostalgia of people who think memories can be merchandised. On the planning docket, a placeholder sits Lake District activation. What it means is simple Maple Hollow will be called Blight, so a brochure can be printed. Maple Hollow lies in the valley like a palm full of lifelines, mill houses with patched roofs, chain-link gates, porches where mail gets opened and life gets parsed. People aren't blight just because you can model a higher tax base. I text Janelle Price, who runs the church pantry. Meeting still on for tomorrow. Heard whispers it moved. She calls instead of replying. Pushed a week, she says. The Whitfields volunteered to underwrite the Christmas charity dinner. Said the meeting would play better then. Community feels. Of course they did. Need coffee? We're okay, she says. But come by if you need the company. I open my work portal. The Good Work Waits Transformer lead times vendor bids a bond footnote that could chew the city if we don't trim it. I click into HR to approve a final onboarding packet. Mason Rudd, VP Finance. I recruited him for 6 months, coaxed him off a competitor with the promise of building something that serves people as well as profit. Smart, blunt. We've only met on video. He thinks E.L. Morris is a stern voice behind a clean background. One signature remains. I sign then, out of habit, Google his name. The Whitfield Foundation newsletter pops first, a glossy photo of men in coats holding champagne beneath a garlanded arch. Mason stands center-left, half-smile, eyes wary. Beside him, relaxed like a man who has never been told no, is a jawline I recognize from business profiles, Graham Whitfield heir, with a grin shaped like a deed. My stomach does the elevator drop. The caption reads, Holiday Partners Reception Welcoming Community Champions, Tessa's important boyfriend. The Whitfields underwriting the dinner that will put cameras on casseroles. My new VP photographed in their wreath-lit glow. The screen blooms with a voicemail icon. I press play. Here's how this will go, Tessa says, voice flat. If you show up tomorrow or any day this week, I'm calling the sheriff and telling them you're unstable and harassing us. Don't make me do that. Don't ruin this for me. I let it run again. The radiator ticks. I set down my tea. My hands are steady. The flu left me weak. This leaves me awake. People say money changes you. Maybe it did. It let me buy silence. It let me believe love could be protected from status if I hid the facts well. But status isn't a number, it's a habit. Mom reaches for it every day. Tessa made a brand out of it. Dad pretends not to notice because noticing means conflict. I spent years being useful so they didn't have to be kind. I pull up Bluefern's org chart and Mason's onboarding timeline, tracing each box like a map through a county I thought I knew. The Whitfields don't need me to like them. They need the credibility my company can buy them. They think they're walking into Christmas with a nobody they can manage by excluding. The truth is simpler and sharper. I close HR and catch my reflection in the monitor hair in a knot, a woman who still has mom in her phone instead of Lorraine. I tap the voicemail and save it. He's my employee, I say to the empty room, testing the sentence like a board under my heel. He's my employee. Rain rattles the panes. A flight reminder buzzes. I swipe it away. Another message lands on top of the first. Tessa again. If you come, I'll have you removed. Sheriff's already aware. I look at the warm lights I strung around the window. Outside headlights smear up Bowcatcher. Maple Hollow's porches tick in the rain. I can't feel the fever anymore. I can feel something else, something I haven't let myself use in years. I open a clean page and start a list, ink not memory gifts to return, a ledger to print, Janelle to call, lines I will not allow to be crossed. I cap the pen. The room feels warmer. My phone buzzes again. I already know what decision it wants. I let the screen go dark and say it once more to be sure. He's my employee. By morning, the rain had hardened into cold sunlight. My apartment smelled faintly of coffee and metal, the scent of decisions. I sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by files I usually keep locked away, the receipts of a double life. Copies of cashier's checks to my parents' mortgage servicer. Wire transfers labeled equipment lease cover. Anonymous donations to the church pantry, the youth center, the girls' robotics team. I'd built Blue Fern systems from a folding table and a used laptop, and every quiet success was tucked behind the initials E.L. Morris. Nobody had ever connected those letters to the daughter who wore thrifted cardigans and showed up late to family dinners. They thought I designed websites for solar contractors. They never knew I built the infrastructure. I powered on my laptop and opened the vendor dashboard. A web of Shell LLCs crisscrossed my screen, Whitfield Development at the center, radiating outward like a spider's silk. They'd bought up parcels around Maple Hollow under different names. South Point Renewal, Carolina Heritage, Lakeshore Group. The goal was obvious. Own the whole valley, bulldoze the mill houses, and replace them with heritage cottages that looked handcrafted but weren't. The town would call it progress. The families who built it would call it eviction. In my inbox sat a draft from Mason Rudd's subject line, Bond Proposal Update. He'd attached a spreadsheet outlining a financing model for our newest municipal partner. Even half sick, I could spot the flaw, a hidden clause tying future projects to a private equity group. I replied under the corporate signature, trimming, tightening, questioning. 5 minutes later, Mason wrote back, "Excellent catch, EL. You're relentless." I smiled. If only he knew who was behind the initials. I checked the clock. It was past noon. I called the Grove Park Inn and booked a suite for the 24th through the 26th, the kind with a balcony overlooking the pines. No family rate, I told the clerk. Business. Then I arranged a black car service for Christmas Day at 11:30 sharp. Not a taxi, not an Uber, a driver who opened doors and asked no questions. After that, I phoned my counsel. I need a notarized 5-year accounting of all disbursements from the Morris Family Trust. Mortgage, medical, cash transfers, everything. All of it, he asked. Every cent, I said. And have it bound in leather. When I hung up, guilt pricked through the armor. Not pity, grief. The end of pretending I was part of their story. I pulled on my coat and walked the 4 blocks to St. Gabriel's, where the smell of powdered sugar and percolating coffee drifted from the fellowship hall. Janelle Price sat folding bulletins, silver hair, pinned up eyes warm as always. "You look tired, child," she said. "Work again." "Work always," I said. I told her the rumor I'd heard that the Whitfields were bankrolling the charity dinner, pushing the zoning meeting to coincide. That way, she said, they can say it was the Lord's blessing, not the county's vote. She laughed, but it wasn't amusement. It was armor. I hesitated, then said, if someone were to stop them, they'd need to show more than outrage. They'd need numbers, plans, money that isn't dirty. Janelle sipped her coffee. "You have those things, I might." She studied me like a woman reading weather signs. "Names don't impress me," she said finally. "Habits do. Bring your habits to the meeting next week." The door opened, and a gust of cold air swept in with a man holding a camera bag, Rowan Hale, the local reporter. He greeted Janelle, then turned to me. "Ella Morris. Right, you were at the co-op presentation last spring, the one about grid equity. That was me. You made the county engineer sweat through his shirt," he said with a grin. "Still doing the same work?" "Something like that." His voice had the steadiness of someone who'd seen worse than zoning drama. Janelle teased him about chasing real news, and he promised he'd write something worth reading if anyone ever told the truth around here. When he left, Janelle leaned closer. "That one listens before he talks. Rare breed." I nodded but didn't answer. By the time I got home, the sun was sliding behind the ridges. The city looked like a painting, brick facades washed in amber light, smoke curling from chimneys. I drove east toward Maple Hollow. The closer I got, the older everything felt. Screen doors hung crooked mailboxes, lean children's bikes rested in mud. Yet there was dignity in every board. On one porch, a boy practiced free throws with a half-flat ball, counting under his breath. The glow from a string of mismatched bulbs lit his face. I'd paid the electrician who rewired that house last winter. The porch light came from my anonymous donation. He shot again, missed, laughed, and tried once more. I parked and stepped out, breath clouding. Every window held a life my family dismissed as quaint. I thought about Graham Whitfield's smiling face on the newsletter, about Tessa's eagerness to belong to his circle, about how easily they'd trade integrity for a seat at a prettier table. I wasn't just furious. I was tired of being quiet. For years I'd told myself silence kept peace. But peace built on lies is just delay. On the drive back, I made my decision. I wasn't going to hide behind initials anymore. Not for them, not for anyone. I'd show up to that dinner not as the failure they described, but as the person who'd kept their lights on. I'd look Graham in the eye and let him realize what kind of empire he'd walked into. And I'd do it in the simplest way possible, by being there, by existing in full daylight. My phone buzzed as I merged onto the highway. The name flashing on the screen wasn't family, it was an unfamiliar number. I let it ring, assuming spam, until the voicemail tone clicked. A woman's voice followed, crisp and official. "This is Deputy Carla Nguyen with Buncombe County. Ms. Morris, I just wanted to confirm we've received notice of a potential trespass concern at the Morris residence. Caller identified as your sister Tessa. We're required to inform you of the report. No charges filed, but please be advised. I gripped the wheel. My family had involved law enforcement before I'd even booked my flight. I pulled over under a street lamp and replayed the message twice. Somewhere between the lines of that voicemail was fear, not mine, theirs. They were afraid I might show up and dismantle the fantasy they'd built. The dashboard clock blinked 9:07. I sat there a long minute listening to the hum of the heater, the distant rush of tires on wet asphalt. Then I started the car and drove home, steady hands on the wheel. Tomorrow I'd confirm the suite, finalize the trust report, and finish drafting my year-end speech for the firm. Every line of it would be clean, unflinching mine. The family I was born into could lie about. I woke to a blue-gray morning that smelled of snow not quite fallen. The city was hushed, half empty, everyone gone to family tables I wasn't invited to. On my dresser, the dark green cashmere dress weighted, its fabric soft as a held breath. I'd chosen it because it said nothing boastful. Simple diamond studs, hair pulled back, no perfume, just clean resolve. The black Mercedes idled at the curb when I stepped outside. The driver, a middle-aged man in a wool coat, took my bags without a word. In one, I carried two neatly wrapped gifts, a silver watch for my father, a leather-bound poetry collection for my mother. In the other, a plain gift bag with the notarized financial ledger, its pages heavy with proof. As we left Asheville, behind the ridges were rimmed with frost, their trees bare and brittle. The drive to Woodvale felt both endless and too quick. My heart thudded, not from fear, but from focus. I'd spent 30 years letting them define who I was. Today, I'd define myself. The Morris house appeared around the bend, its white siding glowing beneath garlands and a rented nativity set. In the driveway sat my father's aging truck, my mother's sedan, and a sleek silver coupe that gleamed like a threat. Graham's car. Through the bay window I saw movement, gold light, the shimmer of crystal. Laughter carried out even before I stepped from the car. When I reached the porch, the door opened mid-knock. My mother filled the frame, dressed in red satin pearls, catching the light. The smile on her face crumpled like thin paper. "Ella," she hissed, "you can't be here. I told you not to come." Her voice shook, not from nerves but rage. "I just came to drop off gifts," I said. "I won't stay long." "Gifts," she repeated as if the word were obscene. "We don't want—" A shrill voice from inside cut through her sentence. "Who is it?" "The caterer." "Julian's starving." Tessa appeared behind her sequined gold dress, catching the light makeup, perfect eyes already sharp. When she saw me, the blood drained from her face. "Get out," she said flatly. "You are not welcome here. Mom, tell her to leave. Now." Dad's heavy footsteps thudded across the tile. He appeared behind them, voice booming with false authority. "Ella, don't make a scene. You're embarrassing your mother. Go home." I looked at all three of them standing shoulder to shoulder in their own polished hypocrisy. "Embarrassing you," I said quietly. "I'm just standing in the doorway." Tessa turned her head, her tone switching to syrup. "It's just my sister," she called over her shoulder. "The one I told you about, the difficult one. She's having a little episode." She was performing, and I knew exactly for whom. I stepped past my mother and into the foyer. The air was thick with roasting turkey cinnamon and a kind of tension that coats the tongue. The tree glittered in the corner, silver and gold. Near it stood a man with a champagne flute, tall, trim, tailored jacket expression, polite to the point of boredom. Graham Whitfield. And beside him, holding a second glass, was Mason Rudd. Mason turned at the sound of my heels. The recognition hit him in slow motion. First confusion, then disbelief, then the shock of realization. His glass halted mid-air. "Ms. Morris," he said, voice barely a whisper. The room froze. My mother's hand clamped around my arm. Tessa's eyes went wide. "What?" Graham asked, his tone sharp. Boss Mason said louder this time. "What are you doing here?" The word rippled through the air like a stone breaking the surface of water. My father blinked. Boss, he repeated as if the syllable itself insulted him. You must be mistaken. I smiled slightly. He's not. I looked at Mason. It's good to see you, though. I didn't expect it here. Graham's face shifted, practiced charm reasserting itself. So you two know each other? I set the gifts on the sideboard and turned to face them all. Mason works for me, Blue Fern Systems. I'm his CEO. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Tessa laughed brittle and high. She's joking. My sister exaggerates sometimes. She's dramatic. I'm not joking, I said. And I'm not unstable despite the report you filed. My voice stayed calm, almost gentle. I built Blue Fern 8 years ago. I own it outright. We specialize in renewable grid integration and public infrastructure. And Mason here is our new vice president of finance. Mason cleared his throat, still reeling. Yes, that's correct. Ms. Morris hired me last quarter. I wasn't aware you were related. His eyes flicked to Graham, apology fighting confusion. Graham's smile barely moved. Well, that's quite the coincidence, he said, glass lowering. Your sister's been telling us how dedicated you are to office work. We were just talking about community growth, actually. Were you? I asked. Because the company you represent, Whitfield Development, is currently buying parcels in Maple Hollow through shell entities. That's not growth. That's displacement. The air in the room shifted. My father coughed into his fist. My mother reached for a napkin as if wiping away the truth. This is not the time, she murmured. Oh, it's exactly the time, I said, stepping closer to the table. You didn't want me here because you thought I'd embarrass you. Because he... I nodded toward Graham. Moves in circles I don't understand. But I know those circles better than you think. Tessa's hands trembled. You don't know what you're talking about. Actually, I said, pulling the gift bag from my arm, I do. I placed it on the table with a quiet thump. This is a notarized ledger. Every mortgage payment I covered, every medical bill, every tuition, every gift you ever pretended was your own. I brought it because I thought you might want to see what your embarrassment funded. Lorraine's face went gray. Ella, stop, she whispered. You're ruining Christmas. Christmas was ruined the second you called me a liability, I said. I'm just clarifying the record. Behind her, Graham had gone still. The calculation behind his eyes was visible now, like gears catching. He smiled without warmth. Well, this has certainly been enlightening, he said. I think we've all misunderstood one another. I'm sure there's a way to make this mutually beneficial. I turned to him. You mean profitable? His shrug confirmed it. Let's not pretend otherwise. You have influence. I have access. Maple Hollow could be the start of something remarkable for both of us. Before I could answer, Mason's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen and frowned. Ms. Morris, I think you should see this. He crossed the room and held out his phone. On the display was a press release cued for 3 o'clock. Whitfield Development partners with Blue Fern Systems to deliver sustainable luxury housing in western North Carolina. My signature E.L. Morris appeared at the bottom. I hadn't signed a thing. Graham didn't blink. A simple misunderstanding, he said. Public relations moved fast. They assumed you'd be on board. I stared at the glowing screen, pulse steady. You forged my consent. Call it alignment, he said. We're all after progress here. I looked at him, then at Mason, whose face had gone ashen. When does it publish? 3 p.m. sharp. Then we have 2 hours. I turned back to my family, who stood frozen in tableau, the mother who traded dignity for dinner parties, the father who mistook silence for authority, the sister who'd built her world on pretense. You wanted to impress your guest, I said. Congratulations. He's about to learn exactly who you are. As I reached for my coat, Graham's voice followed smooth as ever. You can't stop what's already in motion. I looked over my shoulder. Watch me. And for the first time all day, Mason smiled, a quiet, dangerous smile that told me I wasn't walking into this alone. The clock on the mantel read 12:47. The trap was already sprung, I just had to turn it back on them. The front door clicked shut behind me, sealing in their shocked silence. The cold outside hit like clean water, clearing my head. Mason followed me out, his breath fogging in the sharp air. "He forged your signature," he said. "That release goes live in less than 2 hours. Then we move faster," I said. "Can you kill it from your end?" "No. It's embedded in a syndication feed. Once it drops, half the outlets will mirror it automatically. But if we issue a counterstatement from the official Bluefern account with time-stamped verification, we can override it before it hits full circulation." His eyes searched mine. "But we'll be declaring war on the Whitfields in public." "Good," I said. "They started it." We stood by the car, exhaust drifting like smoke. My fingers were already on my phone, typing into the company's encrypted comms channel. "Emergency lockout," I wrote. "All outgoing releases suspended. Prepare counterstatement opposing any Whitfield development partnership. Focus on community ownership, transparency, and ethical land use." Within seconds, my comms director Sophie responded with a terse acknowledgement. Mason watched, jaw set. "I'll call legal," he said, already dialing. Back inside, voices rose behind the door. I could hear my mother hissing something about humiliation, my father's deeper grumble, Tessa crying that I'd ruined everything. I didn't go back in. The argument was old, endless, and sterile. I had other things to do. I opened my laptop in the car, tethered it to my phone, and began cross-referencing the Whitfield shell corporations with our own vendor database. They'd hidden their acquisitions behind generic names, but the tax IDs didn't lie. The same parent company controlled both the land purchases and several of our subcontractors, meaning they'd been using Bluefern's infrastructure to legitimize their buyouts. Every invoice, every permit was a stepping stone to the takeover. "Check this out," I said to Mason. He leaned in through the open car door. "They've been submitting permit requests under Southeastern Renewable Holdings. Same address as a Whitfield front. They plan to use our sustainability license as cover for their development scheme." "You're kidding," he muttered. "That's fraud by misrepresentation." "Exactly," I said. "And if we release our own statement at 2:58 exposing that connection, it'll invalidate their filings before the county meeting tonight." "There's a meeting tonight, commissioners vote at 8, emergency session. Rowan texted me about it this morning. They're trying to push the rezoning through before New Year's." Mason swore softly. "Then we need evidence ready before sundown." He looked back toward the house. "And what about them?" "They're collateral damage," I said. "They chose the wrong side." I stepped out of the car and back toward the porch. My mother opened the door before I could knock. Her expression was pale fury. "You've humiliated us," she whispered. "Do you know what you've done?" "Yes," I said. "I've told the truth." "That man was supposed to help our family," she said, voice trembling. "You've destroyed that chance. He was supposed to help himself," I corrected. "And you were willing to sell your daughter's dignity to buy a seat at his table." My father appeared behind her, his face flushed. "We just wanted to move up in the world," he said. "You think it's easy living with your mother's disappointment, with everyone calling us provincial?" "You wanted out," I said. "You could have worked for it. Instead, you chose to rent respectability from people who exploit towns like ours." Tessa stormed into the foyer, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "You're jealous," she snapped. "You've always been jealous of me. Of what I asked quietly. Of pretending. Of being a puppet for men who use your vanity as currency." She lunged forward, but my father held her back. "Get out!" he barked. "You've made your point." I turned toward the living room doorway where Graham now stood, perfectly calm, hands in his pockets. "You should have stayed gone, Ms. Morris," he said. "We could have worked together. Now you've forced me to protect my interests. By forging my name, by doing what's necessary. Business doesn't reward morality, it rewards momentum. You can either ride it or get crushed beneath it." I took a step closer, lowering my voice. "Maple Hollow isn't a spreadsheet, Graham. It's people, children, Families who built this county before your grandfather's trust fund ever existed. Sentiment, he said with a smirk. A poor person's currency. Maybe, I said. But it's legal tender in the world I live in. My phone buzzed a message from Sophie, counter statement drafted. Need approval. I scrolled through it quickly. It was perfect. Simple, factual, devastating. Publish at 2:58, I wrote back. Attach verified timestamps and all sourcing. Graham watched me type. You really want to do this? He asked, tone almost admiring. You'll drag your own family's name through the mud just to spite me. Not spite, I said. Correction. From the corner, Mason's phone rang. He stepped away to answer, speaking low. When he returned, his face was grim. Deputy Nguyen is on her way, he said. Another anonymous complaint, trespassing and harassment. Filed 15 minutes ago. I exhaled slowly. Of course. They're panicking. When the patrol car pulled up, blue lights flashing against the garlanded porch, Graham folded his arms like a spectator awaiting the next act. Deputy Nguyen climbed the steps, professional and calm. Afternoon, ma'am. We received a report. I handed her the leather-bound folder. This is a notarized record of financial transfers to this address for the past 5 years. I'm the payer. They're the recipients. The report you received is false. She skimmed the cover page, eyebrows lifting slightly. Understood, she said, slipping the papers back. Looks like a family disagreement, not a criminal matter. I'd suggest you all keep it civil. I intend to, I said. Can I offer you coffee? Appreciate it, but no, she said, and left as quietly as she'd arrived. The silence that followed was suffocating. My mother turned away, muttering something about shame. My father retreated down the hall. Tessa stood in the corner, trembling between rage and humiliation. Only Graham remained composed. You're impressive, he said softly. Cold, but impressive. I'm clear, I said. There's a difference. Mason's phone pinged again. He glanced at the screen, then showed it to me. A county government bulletin time-stamped moments ago. Emergency session rezoning vote, 8:00 p.m., County Courthouse Annex. I felt the blood drain from my face. They're doing it tonight. Exactly, Mason said. They're accelerating while we're distracted. Then another message flashed on my phone from Rowan. Vote pushed up. Chair just added Whitfield item under special business. You need to be there. I looked back toward the living room. Through the archway, I could see the twinkling Christmas lights reflected in Graham's untouched champagne. He thought the battle was already won, that the press release and the commissioner's handshake would guarantee his victory. My family stood behind him, hollow-eyed, clinging to whatever illusion he offered. I turned to Mason. We'll need every document linking those LLCs to Whitfield before that meeting. Already on it, he said. And the counter-statement goes live in an hour, I said. 2 minutes before his press release drops. I walked to the door, hand on the knob. Behind me, my mother's voice trembled. Ella, please stop this before it goes too far. I looked over my shoulder. It already has. Outside, the sun was sinking behind the ridges, staining the snow gold. The town lay quiet in the valley below, unaware of the storm about to hit. Graham thought he'd trapped me in a public scandal. He'd forgotten that truth once lit doesn't go out quietly. I glanced at Mason. Let's get to the courthouse, I said. We'll see who still calls me nobody when the vote starts. The courthouse annex smelled like pine cleaner and cold air. Rows of folding chairs faced a dais draped with garland and a half-dead poinsettia. Commissioners in Christmas sweaters murmured over coffee, while lobbyists with slick hair shuffled papers behind them. Maple Hollow families filled the back rows, faces weary but alert. I slipped in beside Janelle Price, who clasped my hand briefly. Glad you came, she whispered. They didn't expect you. I could feel eyes on me, the press, the developers, the ones who'd written me off. I sat straighter. In less than 5 minutes, they'd start the vote to erase an entire community. The overhead clock ticked toward 8. I could hear the scrape of metal chairs, the low hum of anticipation. Graham Whitfield stood near the aisle, his navy suit perfectly pressed, shaking hands, smiling, making small jokes about traffic and progress. Behind him, my mother and sister sat in the front row, shining like ornaments, all nerves hidden behind practiced smiles. My father lingered near the back hat, in his hands looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. When the chairwoman called the session to order, the murmur died instantly. She read through the agenda, voice crisp, until she reached Item 7, Lake District Activation Rezoning Request. Graham stepped forward, delivering his opening statement with the polished rhythm of a man accustomed to applause. He painted a picture of heritage boutiques, sustainable luxury, and economic revitalization. Every phrase was honeyed poison. This project, he said, will bring jobs, tourism, and modern energy systems to a region long overlooked. It's time to let progress shine through the pines. He finished to polite clapping from his corner of the room. I could feel Janelle stiffen beside me. Then came the public comment segment. Ordinary people. My people walked up one by one to the microphone. An elderly woman in a patched coat spoke first. My daddy built our porch from mill scraps in '72. I still sleep there in the summer. Please don't take that away. A young nurse followed, voice shaking. If my rent doubles, I'll have to leave. There's nowhere else for us to go. Then a teenage boy, face flushed from courage, said quietly, "That lake you're trying to buy, that's where my granddad's ashes are. You can't sell a memory." By the time Janelle rose to speak, the room had gone still. She leaned on her cane and let the silence work for her. "You can call it progress," she said, "but it's just profit with better lighting. Maple Hollow doesn't need to be replaced. It needs to be respected." She nodded toward the commissioners, her voice steady as scripture. "Every community has its test. This is yours." Graham's smile wavered just slightly. The chair thanked Janelle and looked down at her notes. "Next," she said, "we'll hear from Ms. Ella Morris." A few whispers rose from the back rows. I stood, walked to the microphone, and felt the weight of every eye in the room. My voice sounded clearer than I expected. "My family didn't want me here tonight. They said I'd embarrass them. Maybe I will. But I built my company on one belief: progress doesn't mean displacement. It means designing systems that lift everyone, not just the ones who can buy the view." I clicked the tablet I'd brought, and the projector behind the commissioners came to life. A map of the county spread across the screen, each red dot marking a shell corporation tied to Whitfield Development. "This," I said, "is the network of LLCs behind the Lake District proposal. Each one funnels money back to the same parent company through disguised contractors, some of them listed as Blue Fern vendors. These aren't partnerships, they're cover stories." A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. Graham stepped closer, jaw tightening. "This is defamation," he said loudly. "Completely unverified." "It's documented," I said. "Your corporate filings are public record, and before you call this coincidence, maybe you should explain why your press release claims Blue Fern Systems has already partnered with you." I lifted my phone and tapped once. Behind me, the screen updated Sophie's counterstatement live at 2:58, timestamped and verified. "Blue Fern Systems opposes any partnership with Whitfield Development," it read. "We stand with the Maple Hollow community in advocating ethical and community-owned renewal." The room erupted. People clapped, shouted, stood. Graham froze mid-step, color draining from his face. Mason, who'd entered quietly a few minutes earlier, now moved to the aisle, handing printed packets to the commissioners, copies of invoices, shell company links, proof of false disclosures. I kept my voice steady. "The truth is, this project was built on misrepresentation. These people," I gestured to the crowd, "were never consulted. You don't get to erase their homes and call it progress." From the front row, Tessa shot to her feet, her voice shrill. "She's lying. She's jealous. You don't know what she's like. She's always been against family success." Lorraine stood too, hands wringing her sequined shawl. "Please," she begged, eyes darting toward Graham. "We can fix this privately." "There's nothing private about betrayal," I said quietly. "You taught me that." The chairwoman banged her gavel. "Order!" Her expression had shifted from polite neutrality to grim focus. "We'll proceed with the vote." Papers shuffled. The commissioners looked at one another uneasy, all in favor of approving the Lake District rezoning. 2 hands rose, all opposed, 2 more went up. A tie. The final vote belonged to the chairwoman. She lifted her hand, hesitated. A security officer leaned down, murmuring something in her ear. She frowned, then addressed the room. "We've just received updated financial filings from the State Elections Board," she said slowly. "They show unreported contributions from Whitfield-affiliated entities to several local campaigns, including members of this board. These documents must be reviewed before any decision can be finalized." The room burst into noise, gasps, shouts, the scrape of chairs. Graham swore under his breath, face hardening into disbelief. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "Procedural interference." The chair ignored him. "Due to the new evidence, the vote will be postponed pending investigation." Meeting adjourned. She struck the gavel once more and the sound echoed like thunder through the hall. For a second, nobody moved. Then the crowd erupted, cheers from the back rows, hands clapping, someone shouting, "Maple Hollow stands!" I felt the air rush out of my lungs, not victory yet, but something close. Graham turned on me, voice low. "You think you've won? You just stalled it." "That's enough for now," I said. "Sometimes time is the sharpest weapon." Janelle reached me first, wrapping her frail hand around mine. "That's the first breath this town's had in years," she said. "Don't let it be the last." Rowan appeared next, camera slung over his shoulder, eyes bright. "You just rewrote the headline," he said softly. "How does it feel?" "Like the start," I said. Across the aisle, my family stood frozen. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes. My father looked as if someone had drained the color from him. Tessa whispered to Graham, her words frantic. He didn't respond. He picked up his briefcase and walked out the side door without looking back. The cold outside was louder than the noise behind me. I stood on the courthouse steps, lights from patrol cars flashing blue across the snow. The courthouse bell struck 8:30. It wasn't over, but for the first time in a decade, I felt something new, freedom shaped like consequence. From down the street came the laughter of Maple Hollow kids, chasing one another through the cold. Their parents followed slower, talking, relieved. I watched them disappear into the night and whispered to myself, "They'll keep their homes." The wind caught the words, scattering them like a promise. Behind me, Rowan's voice called, "They're about to hold a press conference inside." I turned toward him. "Let them," I said. We already spoke louder. But even as I said it, I knew this fight wasn't finished. The Whitfields wouldn't give up their grip without a spectacle. Somewhere in the noise of the crowd, a plan was already forming. And whatever they planned next, I would be ready. The courthouse doors swung open behind me, spilling noise and fluorescent light into the winter night. Reporters shouted questions that sliced through the cold, but I kept walking down the steps until I reached the quiet at the bottom. My phone buzzed with messages. Congratulations from employees, clipped press inquiries. One from Sophie reading, "You bought us credibility tonight." Mason's name flashed next outside. "We need to talk." He stood near the corner, breath-steaming coat unbuttoned. "You should know," he said, voice low. "Graham's already calling in favors. He's trying to spin the delay as political bias." "Let him," I said. "We're not fighting for opinion. We're fighting for proof." I opened my phone camera and hit play on the recording I'd made an hour earlier. Graham's voice crackled from the speaker, sharp and smug. "We accelerated the vote to keep opposition in the dark." "Timing is everything." Mason listened, eyebrows lifting. "That's admission of manipulation." "And it gets better," I said, scrolling forward. "He admits to nudging the schedule through a commissioner's office." Mason exhaled. "You've got him cornered." "Not yet," I said. "But we will." Deputy Nguyen crossed the lot toward us, her flashlight beam cutting through the dark. "Ms. Morris," she called. "Mr. Rudd." Her tone was neutral but alert. "We're taking formal statements tonight. The chair wants a clean record for the ethics board." I nodded. You'll have mine by midnight. And there's more. I handed her the phone with the audio file queued up. She listened for 20 seconds, then slipped the device into an evidence pouch. I'll log this. It's substantial. She glanced back toward the courthouse, where Graham was cornered by another officer. He's not happy. Neither am I said. But at least we're both telling the truth now. Inside, the echo of the gavel still rang in my head. My mother's voice rose somewhere behind me. I turned and saw her descending the steps with my father and sister, faces pale under the streetlights. Lorraine's eyes were wide and wet. Why would you do this? She demanded. To us. To your family. You mean, why would I expose a criminal scheme you supported? I said. You stood beside him. Mom, you vouched for him. He believed in us, she said weakly. He made us feel important. He made you feel owned, I said. There's a difference. Tessa stepped forward, mascara-streaked mouth trembling. You humiliated me, she said. In front of everyone. He was supposed to propose tonight. Do you understand what you took from me? I stared at her, the words too shallow to hold the gravity of what she'd done. You almost cost a town their homes, I said. You were willing to burn people's lives for a photo shoot. You think you're better than us? She spat. You're just colder. No, I said. Just awake. My father's voice cut through, rough and hoarse. Ella, stop. You made your point. Let it go. I turned to him, and something in me cracked. You knew, didn't you? His silence was answer enough. You knew I helped with the mortgage. You knew I paid for the car. You knew all of it, and you let them talk about me like I was a failure because it kept the peace. His eyes fell. It was easier, he murmured. The honesty hurt more than the betrayal. For you, I said. Not for me. Nguyen lingered nearby, politely looking away until I nodded that it was over. We'll need the documents you referenced, she said softly. The financials, the LLC list. We'll collect statements from the Maple Hollow residents too. For now, keep your phone secure. If anything happens, any threats, call me directly. Understood, I said. She gave a small nod and walked toward her cruiser. The blue flash of her lights reflected off the courthouse windows, flickering like a warning. Rowan appeared from the shadows, his camera lowered for once. I've got your quote, he said quietly. But I wanted to check before I publish. What did I say? That sometimes the most dangerous lie is silence. I smiled faintly. Keep it. You sure? Yes. I meant it. He studied me, his expression gentler than it should have been. You okay being the face of this now? If it means they keep their homes? Yes, I said. But it's not about me. He nodded, tucking his notebook away. You're going to get calls. Maybe threats. You should know the Whitfields don't lose quietly. Neither do I. Through the courthouse glass, I could see the commissioners reconvening in private session. 10 minutes later, the chairwoman stepped out with a printed statement in hand. Reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward. Due to irregular campaign filings, she read, the county will delay the rezoning vote for 60 days pending investigation. A public hearing will be scheduled to review alternative community proposals. Cheers erupted from the crowd gathered outside. Someone hugged Janelle. A boy waved a handmade sign that read, "Keep Maple Hollow home." I stood still and let the sound wash over me. Then, just as the moment reached its height, a sudden crack split the air. The courthouse window beside the entrance, shattered glass spraying onto the steps. Screams followed. A car engine roared and tires squealed away down the street. I dropped to my knees instinctively, shards crunching beneath my boots. Rowan crouched beside me, shielding his camera. The patrol lights snapped on again, red and blue pulsing through the chaos. When the noise settled, Nguyen shouted for everyone to stay back. I glanced at the ground near the broken window. Amid the glass lay a crumpled piece of paper folded and weighted with a stone. I picked it up carefully. On the page was a printed image me caught mid-sentence from tonight's meeting, mouth open, eyes fierce. Across it in bold black letters, someone had scrawled one word, nobody. I stared at it until the ink blurred. For years, that word had been my private wound, the invisible brand they'd burned into me with every dismissal. Seeing it now used as a threat felt almost poetic. The word they'd weaponized was finally all they had left. I handed the paper to Nguyen. "They're scared," I said. "Good." She nodded grimly. "We'll increase patrols near your building tonight." As the crowd dispersed, I stood beneath the broken window and looked at the reflection in the remaining glass, half whole, half shattered. It fit. Mason approached, rubbing his hands for warmth. "The press release already hit the wires," he said. "Our statement's dominating every headline. Whitfield's being shredded." "Then he'll hit back," I said. "You ready?" "I wouldn't have joined your company if I wasn't." He offered a thin smile. "See you at sunrise." When everyone was gone, I lingered one last moment on the courthouse steps. The lights above flickered, humming with uneven current. For a heartbeat, the whole building seemed to pulse with the same fragile energy running through me. Freedom, I realize, doesn't arrive clean. It stutters, burns, and forces you to look at what it costs. The patrol cars rolled out, the night settling behind them. I walked toward my own vehicle, breath rising in the cold. My mother's voice echoed faintly in the distance, calling my name, but I didn't turn. Some ties aren't meant to be untangled, they're meant to be cut. When I reached the car door, I looked back once at the dark courthouse and whispered the word that used to hurt me most. Nobody. The glass above me caught a glint of light, and for a moment it looked like the whole building answered back. The next 2 months passed like a storm that wouldn't decide where to land. 60 days of rain and cold mornings of coffee cups lined like sentinels on my desk. Every dawn brought a new headline: Whitfield Development under review. County investigates, PAC donations, local CEO defends Maple Hollow. I didn't ask for fame, but exposure is the price of truth. The first week, Blue Fern's servers nearly crashed under the traffic. Mason managed it with quiet precision, running audits and forwarding subpoenas to our legal team. Every discovery led to another connection, more shell companies, more falsified disclosures. The deeper we dug, the clearer the pattern: Whitfield Development had been using the county like a revolving door for years. Outside the office, the real work began. Every evening after closing my laptop, I drove to the church hall where Janelle had turned the potluck committee into a grassroots task force. The smell of collards and cornbread hung in the air, the long folding tables stacked with petitions and budget drafts. Retired electricians mapped out how to retrofit solar panels. Teenagers measured porch steps for access ramps. Rowan brought his recorder, documenting each meeting, giving people names instead of statistics. "Stories win hearts," he told me one night. "Facts close the deal, but stories open the door." He wasn't wrong. I found myself working beside people I'd never known by name, but had unknowingly supported for years. The nurse who'd once emailed our company about renewable backup systems for clinics. The mechanic who repaired our delivery van without charging overtime. They all wanted the same thing: security, not charity. At the center of it all stood Janelle, her cane tapping a steady rhythm against the linoleum. "We can't wait for saviors," she told everyone. "We have one another, and that's enough." Rowan and I grew closer, though we never named it. He'd walk me to my car after meetings, the air sharp with wood smoke. Sometimes he'd linger, asking questions he already knew the answers to, just to hear me talk. "You ever regret hiding who you were for so long?" he asked once. "No," I said. Back then, anonymity kept me safe. Now it would only keep me small. He smiled, and I realized how rare it was to be understood without explanation. The family I'd left behind made themselves known in quieter ways. Tessa's social media imploded, sponsors pulled out, comments turned vicious. Screenshots made their way to me through anonymous accounts. Influencer caught in rezoning scandal. Sister of CEO denies wrongdoing. Every post reeked of desperation. One night, a courier arrived at my door with a package, no return address. Inside was a box of my childhood keepsakes, a faded softball jersey, a fourth-grade science trophy, a photograph of our family at the lake before everything curdled. No note, just a folded envelope with my father's handwriting. I didn't open it until morning. His letter was short. He wrote that he was sorry that he didn't know how to stand up for what mattered, that he hoped one day I'd forgive him, but understood if I didn't. I didn't cry, but I folded it carefully and put it in the drawer beside my company's founding documents. Both were proof of creation, the kind that costs something real. The Maple Hollow Initiative became a living thing. Blue Fern partnered with a community credit union to establish a revolving micro-grant fund for homeowners. We trained volunteers to audit their own energy systems, teaching independence over dependency. When the first solar panels went up on an elderly couple's roof, the entire block came out to watch. Kids clapped as the inverter blinked to life. That night, we held a small gathering under the newly powered streetlight, its glow soft and defiant against the dark. The air smelled of rain and barbecue smoke. Janelle prayed quietly, thanking God for light that belonged to the people who stood under it. Through those weeks, the town rediscovered itself. The union electricians started a weekend skills class for high school students. Local builders repaired porches for families who couldn't afford contractors. Even the sheriff's office sent volunteers to help haul debris. It was the closest thing to democracy I'd ever seen, messy, slow, but real. The Whitfields didn't vanish. Graham fought back in press conferences, calling me misguided, calling Maple Hollow a sentimental holdout. But every accusation cracked under the weight of evidence Mason uncovered. We found internal memos describing strategic displacements. The state attorney general opened a preliminary review. By mid-February, Graham's empire was bleeding. His investors froze accounts, his PR team resigned, and his name became synonymous with exploitation. The higher he'd climbed, the harder the fall. Even so, the nights weren't peaceful. Anonymous threats still arrived, emails full of venom letters slipped under my office door, rumors of retaliation. Nguyen's patrols passed by my building twice a night, their headlights sweeping across the walls. Sometimes when the street went silent, I'd imagine the window shattering again, the echo of that word, nobody, written across the dark. But fear, I learned, only has power if you stop moving. The 60th day came with a thin layer of snow, the kind that dissolves before noon. The courthouse posted the agenda, final vote, Maple Hollow Development Resolution. Rowan found me that evening, his voice tight. Graham's trying one more play, he said. A last-minute amendment. He's bribed one of the commissioners to sneak it through. If it passes, it nullifies the community plan and resets the zoning. How, I asked. He's claiming the microgrid violates state infrastructure law, says it classifies as a private utility. That's absurd. So was every other stunt he pulled, Rowan said. I closed my laptop the decision instant. Then we go again. You'll speak, he asked. I'll finish what I started. That night before sleep, I reread my father's letter one last time. The handwriting wavered near the end, a single line catching my eye. I hope you keep building things that last. For the first time, I didn't feel angry. Maybe remorse was its own kind of work. Maybe this too was rebuilding. At dawn, I drove through Maple Hollow. The roofs glistened under the pale light. The boy who used to practice free throws on the cracked court was there again, older now, his breath puffing in clouds. When he sank the shot, the ball hit the frozen pavement with a sound that carried like a promise. The solar lights flicked off as the sun crested the ridge, their job done for now. Tomorrow would bring the final vote, the last confrontation, the closing of the circle. As I turned back toward town, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror, tired but certain. The woman staring back wasn't a nobody anymore. She was the storm that wouldn't move on until everything false was washed clean. The next 2 months passed like a storm that wouldn't decide where to land. 60 days of rain and cold mornings of coffee cups lined like sentinels on my desk. Every dawn brought a new headline: Whitfield Development under Review, County investigates, PAC donations, local CEO defends Maple Hollow. I didn't ask for fame, but exposure is the price of truth. The first week, Blue Fern's servers nearly crashed under the traffic. Mason managed it with quiet precision, running audits and forwarding subpoenas to our legal team. Every discovery led to another connection, more shell companies, more falsified disclosures. The deeper we dug, the clearer the pattern Whitfield Development had been using the county like a revolving door for years. Outside the office, the real work began. Every evening after closing my laptop, I drove to the church hall where Janelle had turned the potluck committee into a grassroots task force. The smell of collards and cornbread hung in the air, the long folding tables stacked with petitions and budget drafts. Retired electricians mapped out how to retrofit solar panels. Teenagers measured porch steps for access ramps. Rowan brought his recorder documenting each meeting, giving people names instead of statistics. Stories win hearts, he told me one night. Facts close the deal, but stories open the door. He wasn't wrong. I found myself working beside people I'd never known by name, but had unknowingly supported for years. The nurse who'd once emailed our company about renewable backup systems for clinics. The mechanic who repaired our delivery van without charging overtime. They all wanted the same thing: security, not charity. At the center of it all stood Janelle, her cane tapping a steady rhythm against the linoleum. "We can't wait for saviors," she told everyone. "We have one another, and that's enough." Rowan and I grew closer, though we never named it. He'd walk me to my car after meetings, the air sharp with wood smoke. Sometimes he'd linger, asking questions he already knew the answers to, just to hear me talk. "You ever regret hiding who you were for so long?" he asked once. "No," I said. "Back then, anonymity kept me safe. Now it would only keep me small." He smiled, and I realized how rare it was to be understood without explanation. The family I'd left behind made themselves known in quieter ways. Tessa's social media imploded, sponsors pulled out, comments turned vicious. Screenshots made their way to me through anonymous accounts. Influencer caught in rezoning scandal. Sister of CEO denies wrongdoing. Every post reeked of desperation. One night, a courier arrived at my door with a package, no return address. Inside was a box of my childhood keepsakes: a faded softball jersey, a fourth-grade science trophy, a photograph of our family at the lake before everything curdled. No note, just a folded envelope with my father's handwriting. I didn't open it until morning. His letter was short. He wrote that he was sorry, that he didn't know how to stand up for what mattered, that he hoped one day I'd forgive him, but understood if I didn't. I didn't cry, but I folded it carefully and put it in the drawer beside my company's founding documents. Both were proof of creation, the kind that costs something real. The Maple Hollow Initiative became a living thing. Blue Fern partnered with a community credit union to establish a revolving micro-grant fund for homeowners. We trained volunteers to audit their own energy systems, teaching independence over dependency. When the first solar panels went up on an elderly couple's roof, the entire block came out to watch. Kids clapped as the inverter blinked to life. That night, we held a small gathering under the newly powered streetlight, its glow soft and defiant against the dark. The air smelled of rain and barbecue smoke. Janelle prayed quietly, thanking God for light that belonged to the people who stood under it. Through those weeks, the town rediscovered itself. The union electricians started a weekend skills class for high school students. Local builders repaired porches for families who couldn't afford contractors. Even the sheriff's office sent volunteers to help haul debris. It was the closest thing to democracy I'd ever seen, messy, slow, but real. The Whitfields didn't vanish. Graham fought back in press conferences, calling me misguided, calling Maple Hollow a sentimental holdout. But every accusation cracked under the weight of evidence Mason uncovered. We found internal memos describing strategic displacements. The state attorney general opened a preliminary review. By mid-February, Graham's empire was bleeding. His investors froze accounts, his PR team resigned, and his name became synonymous with exploitation. The higher he'd climbed, the harder the fall. Even so, the nights weren't peaceful. Anonymous threats still arrived, emails full of venom letters slipped under my office door, rumors of retaliation. Nguyen's patrols passed by my building twice a night, their headlights sweeping across the walls. Sometimes when the street went silent, I'd imagine the window shattering again, the echo of that word, nobody, written across the dark. But fear, I learned, only has power if you stop moving. The 60th day came with a thin layer of snow, the kind that dissolves before noon. The courthouse posted the agenda: final vote, Maple Hollow Development Resolution. Rowan found me that evening, his voice tight. "Graham's trying one more play," he said. "A last-minute amendment. He's bribed one of the commissioners to sneak it through. If it passes, it nullifies the community plan and resets the zoning." How I asked. "He's claiming the microgrid violates state infrastructure law. Says it classifies as a private utility. That's absurd." "So was every other stunt he pulled," Rowan said. I closed my laptop the decision instant. "Then we go again." "You'll speak?" he asked. "I'll finish what I started." That night before sleep, I reread my father's letter one last time. The handwriting wavered near the end, a single line catching my eye. "I hope you keep building things that last." For the first time, I didn't feel angry. Maybe remorse was its own kind of work. Maybe this too was rebuilding. At dawn, I drove through Maple Hollow. The roofs glistened under the pale light. The boy who used to practice free throws on the cracked court was there again, older now, his breath puffing in clouds. When he sank the shot, the ball hit the frozen pavement with a sound that carried like a promise. The solar lights flicked off as the sun crested the ridge, their job done for now. Tomorrow would bring the final vote, the last confrontation, the closing of the circle. As I turned back toward town, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror, tired but certain. The woman staring back wasn't a nobody anymore. She was the storm that wouldn't move on until everything false was washed clean. As Ella watched Maple Hollow glow beneath the winter night, it felt like the final breath of a chapter she'd carried for years. The lights stood for more than power, they stood for freedom, hard won. If you felt this story, make sure to subscribe and share your thoughts below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.